All right, so we're back with part two of the lecture. And so I'd asked you to kind of think about the different economies, right? And either an example from your own life or a definition. So let's get into it. The formal economy, probably most of you have an example, the job you have where you're paid with a check or you have to pay taxes on it. Something that's official, is recorded in documents. Now, the informal economy is the opposite. It is not recorded. So either A, maybe you worked for someone, you babysat their kids and they paid you in $20, or you did something and they paid you with a check. But that doesn't mean that they filed, taxable information on that. Sometimes it's, working under the table. So one thing you'll notice is that working under the table is technically illegal. If you do a job for money, you're supposed to report it to the government for taxes. So someone in the informal economy can also be part of the illegal economy. And these boundaries can kind of blur on each other. So the illegal economy is mainly the big difference here is that yes, technically somebody who works for cash and doesn't report it is illegal, but the illegal economy is more things that are violent and deceptive. So a good example would be the drug trade. For the most part, illegal. I mean, marijuana has been legalized, but most drugs are not. Or selling guns to people who are not able to buy guns. That's violent and deceptive. But it could also be things like scamming people through robocalls who say you have to call us to unlock your computer, or scams via email. A social economy can be part of the formal economy that in some people work for a nonprofit and get paid, but a nonprofit company is much different in that it works as a nonprofit model. A nonprofit company, the big difference is the way they're organized, they aren't taxed the same. They have certain benefits because any money they make, any profit they do make, has to be put right back into the company. It doesn't go into someone's pocket. But this can also encompass things like volunteering. So if you work for a church or an after-school group or some type of volunteer activity where you give of your services but maybe aren't necessarily paid, or maybe you get credit for something, that's also the same thing too. The communal economy is somewhat similar, and that there's no cash and it's not recorded like the formal economy. But this is usually the trade of services or goods. So you help a neighbor shovel their driveway and they help you mow the lawn or something. Or you borrow somebody's computer and they loan you their um, phone, that kind of a thing. Cashless exchange of goods or services. And it usually is like on a neighborhood basis, so it's on a very close community basis. Now, the domestic economy I find very interesting because it has a lot of connections. So every one of us has probably at some point in life had to do your laundry, clean your house, take care of either your children, like my kid is home from school right now, or others you've babysat. So the economic activities that revolve running a household. And sometimes they're paid. If you hire someone to watch your children or clean your house and you pay them, that's the formal economy, but oftentimes it's not. So, an interesting idea is a lot of women's jobs in this country are domestic. More women still take care of house and children than men do, and a lot of that is unreported. So, it actually hides the economic activity. Another thing is a lot of jobs that are domestic in nature, like childcare, tend to be highly gendered. And so, by what I mean by that is, we still see, for the most part, that it's the role of women to take care of children and run the house in this country. And for those of you who say, well, that's not how I see it, I would say this: go to a daycare or a McDonald's and notice the amount of women versus men that work in these places. And those are definitely more women than men. So conversely with that, we also tend to see the lowest paid workers in domestic jobs. And so there's a connection between the idea of a gendered economy, that these are jobs that women should do, that are domestic, but also the value of it as well. The last one, the sharing economy, I'm not going to talk about it too much, but it's kind of a new addition. And these are things that are peer-to-peer activities that are aided with social media apps. So a good example would be Uber or Lyft. So people are making money off of this, but it isn't until you have the software and the technology or the apps to help make it work. Otherwise, it would be more of a communal economy. Think about it. Without the app for Lyft, how would the driver know where to go? How would you know how to get the driver? And then how would you pay them? we look at the spatial distribution of growth. So in Chicago, why are some areas more developed economically than others? In other words, why is Michigan Avenue, the Magnificent Mile, why is that a center of economic growth and development? And why is, say, 63rd and Halsted not? Because in the 1950s, 63rd and Halsted was the second busiest shopping district in Chicago. There were 7 major department stores there. None are there today. There's a lot of empty storefronts and empty lots. In the 1950s, North Michigan Avenue, so the part from the river by the Apple Store all the way up to the lake at Lakeshore Drive, today is home to stores like Cartier, Tiffany, Banana Republic, Saks, Macy's, all these high-end shopping districts. In the 1950s, it was mainly just hotels and restaurants, and so not as economically developed. And this idea of cumulative causation kind of makes a case for this. And cumulative causation just says that growth feeds growth, that the more economic growth you have in an area, that drives in other factors that feed that growth, and it becomes kind of like an engine, if you will. Okay, and that is one of the reasons why. So this kind of flow chart, I'm not going to go through it tile by tile, but what it basically says is you start with an area and you introduce some kind of new industry, or you expand existing industry or existing services or something. You basically add something, and that starts this growth. And the growth creates jobs in construction to build the new industry, jobs to work in it, which leads to more training, so that there are more people who are trained to work those jobs and build those things. And the more workers you have, the more services they demand, like banks and grocery stores and gas stations, right? Which also demands people to work those. So you start seeing more and more people with better jobs demanding more services. They have money to spend. So Michigan Avenue starts, there are more stores, and that leads to more people who can work in the stores. And those people use their money from their new job to buy lunch or dinner or go gas stations. And so they build more gas stations, and those people have money, and the population grows, and the economic development grows, right? And as an area grows with more people and more money, that allows the city to get more taxes. So the city gets taxes from sales tax. And if there's more people buying more things, more tax. And why is that a part of growth? That means the city can afford to fund more growth. So they'll build more streets, or they'll make big wide boulevards. So Michigan Avenue has these beautiful planters and big, huge, decorative, fancy streetlights, which makes it more attractive for shopping. And so you start to see this circular pattern that the more growth there is, the growth feeds growth. So this says that there are different regions, and that cumulative causation causes some regions to grow faster or more wealthier than others, because growth can feed itself, right? Now, as growth does this, there's the backwash. What about the areas that aren't part of that growth? So we talked about Michigan Avenue and 63rd and Halsted on the south side. So as Michigan Avenue develops from the 1950s to today, being a luxury shopping district, what happened in the meantime? Why did 63rd and Halsted shrink? Well, a lot of growth that maybe would have happened there, more department stores, more restaurants, as more people were shopping in the other area, there was less customer base. Growth was channeled from that area to another place. In other words, as an area grows, it basically drains the growth opportunity from other areas, and it blocks the growth or even denies it. Okay? And what happens is you have this pattern of areas that are very developed and areas that are very underdeveloped. I'm trying to get my hands in the picture, not working out that well. Right? So let's think of Chicago. You have very rich neighborhoods and very poor neighborhoods. And you can argue that in a capitalist economic system, you need that. You need to have rich and poor neighborhoods. Why is that? Because here's the thing. In capitalism, the whole idea of capitalism, the model of the capitalist economic plan is to accumulate capital. In other words, to make a profit. Now, you make a profit by taking something at one price and selling it for more, right? You buy low, sell high. So if you were to buy real estate in Chicago, right, and it always stayed the same price, if every place was even, there was no difference in how much it cost in Inglewood versus Lincoln Park, then how could you make a profit? Because you'd sell it for the same amount of money you bought it. You'd break even, but you wouldn't make a profit. Capitalism wouldn't succeed. Capitalism needs that clustering, right? It needs areas that are poor where it can basically take value from to the areas that are rich. And that's very similar to the core periphery model. You need the periphery to supply the core, and you need the core to give back the expensive things to the periphery. Another example would be the profit cycle of an individual item. So I'm going to use the example of a cell phone because most of us have a cell phone that is less than 4 years old. Every time I ask that question, I rarely have anybody who says they have a phone more than 4 years old. And here's the question. Is that phone from 4 years ago that much different? I mean, they're a little faster, maybe a little smaller. But my first cell phone from the 90s, as thick as it was, can make phone calls. I could get voicemail. I could get texts. And I can still today my phone now. I mean, yes, my phone also now has a camera. It has a computer. But as a phone, it's still a phone. It's not like the other one became obsolete. So why do we have new phones? And not only that, the phones between year to year, they make a new iPhone like every 2 or 3 years. They're not that hugely different. A little bit. Well, the model of capitalism, when you look at the life cycle of a product, would explain that. Let's start with the iPhone 50. They're making the iPhone 50 because everybody right now has the iPhone 49, right? So the iPhone 50 is in the lab right here, and the scientists and the computer techs are working on it, trying to iron out the bugs. So all these people are working and getting paid, but they're not selling it because it's not ready yet. So they're losing money. They're not profiting. All right. It's day one. They introduced the iPhone 50, and everyone lines up, and we're all excited to get the phone, and people start buying it. And the more they buy, now they start paying back that bet. So now they start making a profit. And the more they sell, the more profit they make. But here's the thing. At a certain point, everybody who's going to buy the iPhone 50 has the iPhone 50, right? Maybe a few people break and get a new one, but for the most part, at a certain point, sales are going to level off. You can only sell so many phones. Now, maybe you get them to buy 2 phones, but even then, at a certain point, everybody has 2 phones. And when sales level off, profit levels off and actually begins to fall slightly because sales begin to drop a little bit, right? So profit drops. So what happens? You start working on the iPhone 51 because then you can start all over again and increase your profit. So this is why we see new cars every year, new phones every year. They make it easy for you to get a new phone, that you finance it, you pay for it over the course of a year or two on your cell phone plan so that you do this, right? Otherwise, if you kept your phone, if you bought your car and you keep your car forever, the car companies don't want that. They want you to buy a new car every so many years. They want you to buy new shoes every year. Another example of uneven economic development is wealth disparity. So if you ever heard the phrase in this country, the 99% versus the 1%, in the United States, let's narrow it down to Chicago. Think about the wealthiest people in Chicago. The people that make the most money make a lot of money. Now think about the people in Chicago who make the least amount of money. And the gap between basically zero for the people on the street who make no money at all versus the wealthiest, that's a pretty large gap per year. And in fact, Britain and the United States have some of the highest gaps between their wealthiest and their poorest residents. Now, what we do find is in a lot of countries, the gap isn't so high. The wealthiest person in Germany doesn't make that much more compared to the United States than the poorest person. There's still a gap, but not as much. In the United States, the average executive who runs a company like Ford or Boeing or Apple makes on average between 950 times more per hour than the person who works for them making the phone. Think about the guy who runs McDonald's, the CEO of McDonald's, and how much money they make, 60, 70 million a year, versus the person making $15 an hour. In Germany and Japan and Italy, the top executives make maybe 200 to 300 times more. Still a big deal, but 200 times more versus 900 times more. We can even see it in Chicago. This map from 2010 shows regional differences by neighborhood. The darker the red, the more distress economically the neighborhood faces. And economic distress is just a measurement of things like how many households are below the poverty line, how high is the unemployment rate, What about the number of people over the age of 25 without a diploma? What is the average income? And when you combine those, I don't think it's a shock for many of you watching this video that the neighborhoods on the west and south side tend to have higher economic distress than those on the north and the lakefront. So we see that disparity even right here, right? So what causes this? What causes some areas to be development, right? Well, one, maybe they have something that pulls resources there. So Chicago is right now really pulling a lot of development when it comes to high-tech industry. Google has a main office here. Uber is moving their main offices here. There's lots of high-tech firms moving to Chicago right now. That is the big driver, right? And why are they coming here? There are resources here for them. The city has a very well-defined high-speed network in those neighborhoods. There are a lot of people who have trained to work in those industries. A lot of people go to school for that industry here. So there's a lot of people in that field. In other words, there's a lot of labor that they need. If you are running a high-tech computer firm, you need a specialized bunch of people to do that. And also, the firms that work with it. There's a lot of other firms here, which draws it in. So you have this concentration of firms and labor kind of helps pull other companies in. And then it also leads to other trades. So we have a lot of corporations have a main office here, like Boeing has their headquarters here. And one of the reasons Boeing moved here was that as a large corporation, they often need lawyers and accountants and advertising firms. And Chicago has a large number of lawyers, accountants, and advertising firms. So the trades they need to support them are located here. Same thing with Uber and Google. These big, huge corporations need those trades. And that is a reason for them to move here. Okay? Another thing is this. When you have a lot of similar types of firms, so you think of Silicon Valley, California, when Apple has its main office headquarters, Google's world headquarters are there, so Google and Apple, Hewlett Packard, a lot of computer companies are there. One of the reasons they're there is that all the innovation at one country, all those people working at Apple, doing the latest and the greatest, right? They talk to their friends across the street at Google because after work they all go to the same bars and restaurants. Many of them went to school together and know each other, so they talk on they talk off of work, and they talk and share ideas. And not only that, they see their neighbors doing these things. There's this idea of, well, they did that, we'll do them one better. Innovation from firm to firm, and that thrives in close contact. So when you get these things 1 through 4, all these things, when they combine and kind of interweave together, it's called a thick market. So Chicago right now is a thick market for high-tech industry, right? There's a lot of different things that make it attractive for high-tech industry to grow here. And that, again, leads to more growth, which can cause that cumulative causation that we talked about. Now, there can be things or centrifugal forces that disrupt it. So you think about centrifugal force. If you spin on a merry-go-round, it wants to throw you off. Centrifugal force, things that would disrupt that, right? So what are some things that can do that? Increasing cost of land. If it becomes increasingly expensive for people to buy land, if it becomes too expensive to buy land on Michigan Avenue, that can stop growth. If you have to pay people more money, they do really well at their job, you give more raises, but at a certain point, if you pay them too much, well, now all of a sudden, you can't profit, and that can also drive down growth. That being said, some industries, specifically like more contemporary modern, this says contemporary electronic ones under my face, they defy that. They find a way to keep on moving, even though it is expensive. For some reason, even though a studio apartment in Silicon Valley goes for about $3,000 a month, which is outrageous, and you would think that would make it hard for people to want to move there, right? That means that they have to pay, Apple and Google have to pay their employees a lot of money to work there so they can afford to live there, more so than if they were in Iowa, for instance. That is still a major region of growth, so there are some reasons why that doesn't always work. When we look at the U.S., we have different clusters. And in the last 50 years, we've seen a major shift in these clusters, especially when it comes to employment, right? Today, we see large areas of economic growth in this country where the main resource is brain power. Chicago used to be known for its steel mills and its factories. Today we're known more for high-tech industry, right? So that's the difference. Brain hubs. People work using their brains, not their muscles anymore. Another example, Ann Arbor, Michigan, is the center of the biotechnical industry in the world. All the genetic modifications, engineering, and medicine that we see, they usually start there. And the reason is that Ann Arbor is also the home of the University of Michigan. So many people get their education in genetics and then get employed there. We've seen industry in this country really, really change. As we talked about in the last chapter, it's moved to the third world. So this area called the Rust Belt in the Midwest. So here's Chicago, Milwaukee, but this is also Detroit and Ohio and Pittsburgh. In the 1950s, the main economic driver here in the cluster was industry. So factories and steel mills in Chicago, car factories in Detroit, coal mining, and steel making over here in Pennsylvania. And what happens is, as we talked about in previous chapters, the steel mills leave. There's competition from foreign car makers like Toyota and Nissan and Honda. And a lot of these factories closed, and the manufacturing jobs with them left. They went to areas of brain hubs as we moved from a industrial model economy as we moved into a service industry. And so a lot of those factories were just left to rust. That's what we call it the Rust Belt, right? Now, that covers a lot of this area, but some areas like Chicago, we were able to transition from a manufacturing hub to a brain hub, and that's why we've maintained our status as a very large growing city compared to, say, Detroit or Toledo. Now, the role of the state in all this, what is the state? Nations, governments, and their role primarily is regulations, laws. States make laws. You can't sell alcohol on a Sunday. That's a regulation of the market. If you sell this, you have to pay 5% extra in tax. So there's various institutions and agencies. So think about cars. If you sell a car, right, the state regulates, it has to have 2 headlights. You can't have tinted windows. It has to be able to burn this type of gas and such a thing. All these different agencies enforce that. Okay? They also set the laws. If you're going to sell a car, it has to, be safe. It has to be certified that it has seat belts. You have to have a certain type of business license to sell cars. So they set all those rules. In some states, you can't sell cars on a Sunday. It's a weird old-fashioned law. So that regulates very much that market for cars. Okay? And all these rules affect economic activity. Some states make it very hard for workers to unionize, which means that if a large factory comes in, they can hire non-union workers, which generally make much more money. Some states encourage unionization. So a good example is this. Cars have been made in Detroit, in America, since the 1900s, and Michigan has been a very labor-friendly state and allowed unions to organize, which meant the workers at Ford got paid a lot, and they do get paid a lot. When Toyota wanted to build a car factory in the U.S., they didn't go to Detroit. They didn't go to Michigan. They built their first car factory in Tennessee. And Tennessee has much different laws. It's very hard to create a union. And so in other words, Toyota could build a factory to build cars in Tennessee without having to worry about unions. So the roles of how the states set the laws had a definite effect. When it comes to the global economy, how do different countries interact? Some countries, their economy is closed. You just don't go to North Korea and open up a McDonald's. It's a very closed economy. It's very hard to do business in Cuba. Various laws. Some countries, there's no laws whatsoever. It's a free-for-all. So that has a very wide effect. Okay? Now, most countries want to be economically sufficient. They want to make money. And if they were a former colony and they're developing and they want to grow their economy, they can do it 2 ways. They can either be an import substitution or export-oriented industrialization. And what that means is this. If you are a country like China, right, and China wanted in the 1970s to become more economically powerful, they decided they were going to be an export-oriented industrialization. The government encouraged its industries to make and sell things that could be sold abroad. And so in the 1970s and 80s, you saw a lot of things that had the stamp made in China. And that was something that they did, and they competed, and they made things at a lower cost. And so countries started buying goods from China. Okay. Today, China is changing to an import substitution. And what that means is this. As China was making goods to sell around the world, like iPhones, if they wanted to buy a car or a computer, they bought a Ford or a Volkswagen, or they bought an Apple computer, and they imported it. So now the government is changing it, and they're trying to develop import substitution. So right now, the Chinese auto industry is growing and getting better and better. And what they want is Chinese people to buy cars from Chinese makers. So buy local. And then that money stays in China. They're building more and more electronics and more of their own cell phones. Okay. There's also this idea between protectionism and free trade. If China's government gives a factory an incentive, they help pay for the building of the factory, that means that the people who own the factory can make the goods cheaper, and they can sell them cheaper than somebody who's an American would, because we don't get that government help. And so some would argue that means the Chinese goods have an unfair advantage. And so what we would do in protectionism is we would put some kind of tax. So so the companies that make iPhones in China, they can pay less minimum wage than we pay here because Chinese laws are different. If they can pay the people less, they can make phones cheaper. So Chinese phones sell better. So the United States says, well, that's not fair to American companies. So we're going to put a tax on phones made in China so they cost the same. We're going to increase the price. That's protectionism, when you basically protect your own economy and your own goods. The other side of that is free trade. And the free trade says you do the best you can at what you can. So maybe we can't make cheaper phones than China, but we can make better cars. And we do free trade, and we can specialize. And everyone does the best they can. Okay? Now the argument is free trade. If everyone is doing what they can best, and they make the best they can with that, that does increase trade. And in fact, free trade, lowering the barriers, means more trade. And as trade increases, as we see more trade, we see more wealth. But the issue with that is the wealth isn't equitable. So as we went and had free trade with China begin in the 1970s, and we increased our trading amount, as China became wealthier, the average Chinese citizen did see a rise in their standard of living. They made more money, but it wasn't even. The rich got richer than the poor right away. So we have development states, and these are states on the semi-periphery. These are states that want to move from the edge to the center. Okay? Now, there have been some states that have done this, and they've gone to export-led economic development, and they've moved from the periphery to the core, and China's a great example. Now, here's the thing, because if you rely on exports only, that means that if the market takes a dive, then you're stuck. So right now, one of China's issues is they rely on selling goods around the world so much, they still haven't quite made that change from export-led economic change. No one's buying anything right now because everyone's off of work. That means that Chinese factories are going to be idle. So they're very vulnerable to things around the world. Okay? So what China has done, and we'll see how this happens, is they've put their public money, the government has changed its money, and they are now investing in infrastructure and education. So they are building highways and bridges and hospitals and schools. And so what happens is the money they put in, well, if you build more highways and trains and you build more factories and more electricity plants, that allows industry to grow. So you build the support for industry. And if you invest in education, the people that come out of your schools can make better goods, right? The more educated they are, they can design their own goods. And so that money is used to grow the economy. One reason in China it works so well is that the Chinese government can do whatever they want. It's not a democratic government. Here, people have a voice to an extent. So I'll use an example in China. They built a dam on the Yangtze River. It's one of the largest dams in the world. A huge project. It would create a ton of electricity. which would help factories. A lot of very free, cheap electricity. And it would drive economic development of that whole region, one of the biggest dams in the world. The problem is the water behind the dam would back up and build a big lake that would flood villages and cause several million people to have to move. If they were going to do that here, if they said we're going to dam the Chicago River, but we're going to flood all of Pilsen, everyone has to move, it'd be a hard sell. But in China, because the government doesn't have to answer to the people, they just do it and move people around. They have a little bit more freedom. They can do that. A good example right now is with the coronavirus, right? And having to quarantine people. In China, the government said basically, this whole city, no one can come, no one can go. Imagine if they said in Chicago, you can't leave your house. Technically, we can leave our house right now. We can go for a walk, right? You can travel to the grocery store. But what if there were actually police on the street saying, get back in your house? So China doesn't have a democratic government. They can do things much more effectively than we can. So there's this idea that the relationship between development, moving from the periphery to the core, requires you have a somewhat strong government with less respect for individual freedoms. In other words, you have to be almost in a sense cruel to be kind. Okay? And here's the other thing. We do find this though. Equitable wealth does correlate with democracy. For the most part, we are the exception. The more democratic a society is, the less the gap in wealth. And some would argue that as our gap has widened, we've become less democratic. Another thing we're going to talk about is the idea of capital and labor. So in an economic system, a capitalist system, you have basically two main components. Capital, which is money, wealth, and those who have it, and labor, those who don't have money or wealth, and the only thing of value they have is their labor, right? So in other words, the capitalist in Chicago would be the person that owns Target. They own the store, the land, and the shops. Somebody who works for Target doesn't own much but the shirt in their back pretty much. They sell their labor to Target, and that's the components of a capitalist system for the most part. We see in the United States that unions have declined since the 1970s. In the 1973, 25% of all Americans were in a labor union. Today it's 11%. And that's reflective of this dynamic. Labor has lost power to capital. Okay? And why does a union give power, by the way? A union is an organization of labor. Labor bands together so they can speak as one voice. So let's go back to Target, right? The owner of Target has capital. He owns the store. The labor, the one person, you walk in and you're a cashier. If you don't like things, what can you do? Pretty much quit. But what if all the cashiers got together and said, if you don't pay us $1 more, then we're all going to quit? That gives them a little bit more strength. And so labor unions are part of this struggle between capital and labor to gain the advantage. One of the reasons there's a gap is different mobility. If Target doesn't want to pay you $1 more an hour, if the entire workforce says we want $1 more an hour, well, Target has one thing in advantage. They can close the store and move to another city or another neighborhood and start over again. But you really can't. So capital has more mobility. If United States auto workers want more money, Ford can move the factory to Mexico. The workers aren't going to move, but the factory will. So capital has more mobility, which gives capital the upper hand in the last 15, 20 years. So capital, the assets, the ownership, and the social relationship that comes with that, the capitalist class, right? And so mobility of capital reinforces that, and it changes the way we make things. We make things now around the world wherever it is cheapest to make them, okay? Prior to that, under the Fordist model, capital and labor were fixed because to make cars, you needed people to have a decent education. They had to have a steady workforce, and so they made them in Detroit. But now, with increased education around the world, better tax laws that we can import cars from any country, it really doesn't matter. And so this idea of flexible production systems and capital allows capital to go wherever it's easiest. It gives capital greater mobility. Just-in-time flexible production is this. How many of you cannot find toilet paper on the shelf lately? So if you're watching this in another year, this won't make sense. I'll have to redo it. The factories that make toilet paper can only make so much. They can't make more than they make per day because they already make pretty much all they can make per day. So there's a steady supply of toilet paper. Now, why all of a sudden is there not enough toilet paper? Well, the demand has gone up. So why doesn't Target or Jewel have these big huge warehouses full of toilet paper? Because for the most part, for many years, these companies have only kept enough goods on their shelves to last the day or two because they can make it all the time. So they make toilet paper every single day. So if they're making toilet paper every single day, right, and you're getting a shipment maybe every 2 or 3 days to your store, then you only need 2 or 3 days worth of toilet paper on your shelf, right? And what happens is we don't really notice this until something happens to cause something to happen. And what happens? The demand for paper goes up because people are panicking. So all of a sudden there's more demand than can keep up with this. And the production systems can't keep up with it right now. Eventually it's going to be fine. Okay. Harvey is a geographer that looks at all of this and has what they call Marxist geography. And he says this: when you look at the geography of a city, when you look at the areas that are poor and the areas that are rich, when you look at capitalism and this idea of globalization, that when you look at geography, you have to inherently understand that there's a Marxist view, and Marxism just says that you are accounting for capital and labor, or class, or money. In other words, when you look at Chicago, you have to understand that the geography of Chicago is influenced by wealthy neighborhoods, capital, and poor neighborhoods, labor, and that kind of conflict between the two. Like I said before, capitalism requires developed or rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods to work. And Harvey says that all of geography has to account for this. So labor. Now labor is the people, the organized labor, the workers that do it. Now if workers organize and band together, they can have a large effect too. So organized labor got together in the 1880s and factory workers all struck for things like the 8-hour workday. We're only going to work 8 hours, and they got that. The idea of the weekend, right? This has been weakened, again, by the global shift we talked about and mechanization. Auto workers aren't as organized as they used to be because now we have robots that can make the cars. So there's less need for people, which weakens the position of labor, right? And again, capital has more mobility, so they can kind of bug out when things get too expensive. Labor can't, right? The idea of this, Walmart, right? So a Walmart store in a small town is usually the largest employer, right? They're a huge store. But Walmart pays its employees minimum wage, very low cost. So a lot of the people that work at Walmart, right, they shop at the Walmart because that's all they can afford because Walmart sells for so cheap. And so what happens is Walmart basically becomes the choice for all these employees that work there. They shop at Walmart. So they don't go to all the other stores and they go out of business. And Walmart basically, its labor becomes its consumers. It's like a kind of a weird little relationship there. So Marxist geography just says that we have to look at social difference in the workplace. We have to look at class, upper class, lower class, middle class, right? That work and income are not only economic, but social differentiators. In other words, right, the resources that you have, the opportunities, all of these vary based on your class. So in other words, are you getting by or are you surviving? So if you are in a situation where you have money saved up, right, you have a savings account, you are probably doing much better in a situation like now where people aren't working and things are closed than if you don't. So are you getting by or are you just surviving? And that affects geography as well. Now we're going to end this with where we are, mass consumption. So the United States economy today is based on the service industry. Most people work selling things or selling ideas, but they don't really make things. But a lot of our economic growth is by people going to places like Target or Walmart and shopping. 66% of our economy is driven by mass consumption. So Target is a huge part of our economy. Even though most of the things they sell aren't made here, the money that you spend to buy that shirt stays here. And that is a main source of economic activity. With an economy that is primarily mass consumption, like the United States, we see some interesting things. Consumer spending is a big part of it. So what drives that? Advertising. And advertising, many of you think it's just to inform. Advertising's main job is to create consumption. How do you know what shirt to buy? How do you know what car to buy? Right? How do you know that Nike is better than Adidas? And advertising tells you that. It may not be telling you the truth, but they are pitching this, right? So if our economy is driven by mass consumption, what you consume is in part dictated by the advertising. Not only that, what you consume is tied to status, right? So a good example would be the kind of car you drive. And if I say close your eyes, imagine the car your doctor drives, how many of you imagine it's a BMW or a Lexus or a luxury car, right? If I say close your eyes and picture the car that I drive, you're probably not thinking the same thing, right? We have this idea of status, right? That if you're rich, you live in a big fancy house and have big cars and big TVs, and it's all about bigger, better, faster. And that is definitely part of the consumer economy. That if you're going to be having the newest phone and the newest electronics and the best clothes, right, that's a sign of your status. But to afford all this, we need credit. So I'd asked before how old your cell phones are. I would guess, in lack of you being able to tell me straight out, most of you do not pay for your phones upfront in cash. You have to sign a year-long contract, you pay $20 a month, and you pay off your phone over a year. You need credit. Most of you have credit cards or loans, right? If you don't have access to credit, then once you spend your money on your paycheck, then you're done. If there's credit available, people can spend more than they make, which is not always healthy, but that's good for mass consumption. I'm going to skip Hotelling's law for now. It won't be in any quizzes, don't worry about that. If anyone's curious, they can send me an email, we'll talk about it. But the last part is, in a mass consumer economy, retailers, not producers, are the dominant force. So in our country, we talk about Apple, we talk about Walmart, we talk about Target. We are known more for selling things now, right? But if you go to Target, most of the goods are made, if you look at the label, in China or Bangladesh. Not many things are actually made here. So it's the consumption of things that are sold in retailers that is more dominant. All right. I'm going to skip these slides, and I'm going to just tell you that they're not going to be on any kind of quiz, other than we've already talked about Marxist political economy. That, in other words, uneven development is just part of how a capitalist economy works. Okay? So remember, these chapter summaries are great tools when you go back to study for the final and the midterm. Or in this case, it'll be your final. So these kind of give you bullet points of what we've been talking about. And there you go. So I'm going to sign off. Hopefully this wasn't too bad. Remember, you can always go back and re-watch it. Take your quiz, take your terms, and thank you much.